go over to the SEC, the marquee matchup I think the marquee matchup this week, that might be debatable, but number 13 LSU, 2.5-point favorites in Oxford, taking on number 20 Ole Miss. Garrett, have you heard anything from Lane Kiffin this week? Because he seems like he's been pretty quiet.
Yeah, he's been a little quiet. I was expecting a lot of noise, after how much he was talking last week against Bama, but kind of quiet. What ended up happening over the weekend?
Well, I think he got humbled a little bit, and
That's
that's saying
probably true.
something. That would be impressive if it actually hit home. But listen, I only bring that up because that's what this game is about for me. We haven't heard from Lane Kiffin. That might be a good sign that he is staying off of Twitter and not trying to troll his opponent and get a victory that way. Maybe he's focusing a little bit more on the field, because this is all about if he can win a coaching battle at home for me. LSU is going to have better talent. LSU is a more talented team. There are flaws that Ole Miss can definitely exploit, and I'll talk about those here in just a second. But this is all about if Lane Kiffin can win a coaching battle and have his team ready to go, because he does not have a signature win at Ole Miss. Think about all the wins that he's gotten at Ole Miss. He does not have a signature win at Ole Miss, other than maybe a couple Egg Bowls. I guess you could give him those. But here's another prime opportunity. LSU coming into your house. There are matchups to exploit, and you've got to figure out the way to cover up some of your discrepancies here, because another big thing that I'm looking at is this offensive line. Bama lived in the backfield last week. 5 sacks, 10 tackles for loss. Ole Miss's offensive line just had no answer for that front seven of Alabama. And guess what? They're going to go up against one that's just as talented this week. So how do the coaching staff at LSU, how do they decide to use Harold Perkins? That's going to be a huge key to this game for me. It's looking like he's been more involved. He forced a fumble and had a sack forced 2 fumbles and had a sack last week, had a sack against Ole Miss. So he's getting to, rush the passer just a little bit more. That was the big question coming out of the Florida State game. But when is he, if ever, going to be unleashed, right? We just keep waiting for him to get to play the role like he played last year. Brian Kelly seems married to the idea that he needs to be a true linebacker that drops into coverage and stops the run and does all that stuff. That's fine and dandy. He's a talented guy. He can do that, but I think you're missing out on his opportunity. Do we let him be unleashed this week? And the other big question, and I think this is going to come down to Kiffin's game plan, maybe even more than his quarterback, is how does Jackson Dart attack this LSU secondary? Because this is an LSU secondary that will give up some yards if you put up any sort of fight against them, right? Will Rogers did not. The poor guys at, I think it was Grambling State that they played in week 2, just could not put up a fight against this LSU secondary. Jordan Travis threw for 359 yards and 4 touchdowns. KJ Jefferson threw for 289 yards and 3 touchdowns, right? So if you can put a competent game plan together, if you can get the ball in the hands of your receivers, you're going to get some yards to the air on this LSU secondary. Now, can Lane Kiffin put that game plan together? I think that's a big question. And can Jackson Dart execute that game plan? Is he the player we saw the first couple games of this year? Or is he the player we saw last year and in the Alabama game last week? That's going to be a big question that Ole Miss needs to answer. Garrett, with all those questions and with my just hatred of Lane Kiffin, I'm going to go with LSU minus 2.5 here. I think they get it done in Oxford.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about this. I'm going to also agree with you. I know we're just kind of going chalk on this one, but, I'm going LSU minus 2.5 as well. I think that this is just a much better team. For me, this doesn't really have very much to do about Ole Miss. Again, it's just kind of LSU being a great team. I wanted to highlight 2 players in specific. Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. are just dynamic wide receivers for the LSU Tigers. They've both averaged about 16 yards per catch, which is disgusting. They both have 5 touchdowns. Brian Thomas Jr. kind of had his breakout game, I think, last week. Just definitely burst onto the scene with that. Not that he wasn't playing well before then, but had a great game last week against Arkansas. I think 5 catches, 133 yards, 2 touchdowns. So great game for him. And I think that when you look at Ole Miss, they weren't able to really make Bama pay for the fact that they weren't that good. And I got kind of swept up into the Ole Miss hype. I just kind of got swept up into, oh, look, Ole Miss is doing good. They've got a great offense. And I went back and looked at it. They're playing Tulane without Michael Pratt to a pretty close game in the fourth quarter. They're playing Georgia Tech to a 7-point game in the fourth quarter. they hadn't really put anybody away. I just kind of looked at some of the finals and was like, oh look, Ole Miss is doing great, and I didn't really look at how they got there. And so look, that's on me. I got swept up in the hype. It's not gonna
Box
happen
score
again.
syndrome. Box
You know,
score
yeah,
syndrome. It hits us all, man. No
it
blame,
hits
no
us all,
shame.
yeah.
It hits us all.
And so yeah, I just kind of got swept up in what Ole Miss is doing. I'm going to acknowledge it, and yeah, I think that it's going to be a little bit of a rout for LSU. I don't think it's going to be particularly close, so I'm taking LSU minus the 2.5 as well. And yeah, I think it's going to be a fun game to watch, but that's going to be if you like offense on one side and Lane Kiffin being sad on the other.
You know, the box score thing didn't make the cut for me. It almost made the cut in what I was going to highlight in this game, but you're absolutely right because in Ole Miss's, signature, if you want to call it that, wins over. I don't call Mercer a signature win. Sorry, Ole Miss fans, but Tulane and Georgia Tech. You're right. Both of those games, the final score looks way more impressive than that game actually was. They were dogfights into the fourth quarter, and the ball just bounced a certain way to take care of business for Ole Miss and make that score look a little bit better. I think you're right. I think that that's going to be something to monitor throughout the year. How does that balance itself out? Does the ball bounce a different way? And all of a sudden, Ole Miss is, not getting his fortune. I think that's a very fair question to ask. As we move on through the rest of the season.
Gracious him. How about that?